So let's get started. First up is going to be David and Fred. So David, Fred?
Fred and I are in the early stages of a long-term project in the fire zone along the McKenzie River in Central Oregon. And as we explore the many unique layers of a forest stripped to its skeletal state, we're often in a state of wonder where questions are more interesting to us than answers. We have three distinct visual approaches we're taking: a documentary approach, a technical approach, and a fine art approach. We're working on two sites that are owned and managed by the McKenzie River Trust. One is beside the river, and the other site is on a hilltop way above the river. These documentary approaches are just giving a sense of place as well as the event, the fire followed by extreme winds. So this is the site beside the river. Some of the layers that we can see here are the effects of the old growth, the logging of the old growth before, and then these second growth trees in their regimented size and age class. These images are up on the hillside above the river. So in addition to the landscape approach, I'm also photographing typologies. I have 9 typologies at this point, and the typologies are created, either they were revealed by the fire or created by the fire. This first typology, canopy, on the first day that Fred and I went up there, I was standing and I looked up and I saw this, and I immediately recognized it as atypical growth habit. The branches of the trees are swooping upward and inward, and it resonated with me as a kind of embrace and a protective hug. After the year that we've all been through, I really connected with this sort of gesture, and I called Fred over and we began to talk about how interesting this was. So the scorch height right here of the trees was about 25 to 30 feet. So the tops didn't actually burn, but the heat rising up off the forest floor created a shrinkage to these conifer limbs and created the swooping nature that you see. That didn't happen with the hardwoods, like the tree on the right. It didn't have this same sort of shrinkage that the conifers are. Oops. Burnt bark, all tree species have different kind of bark, and they all burn very differently. This is an old growth stump that was cut probably 70 to 80 years ago. It's about 8 feet in diameter, and it's been decomposing since that time. There's about a 2-inch space between the burnt wood in the background and the bark in the foreground. This is a piece of big leaf maple. This is another big old growth stump that was cut, and which is not uncommon in the Northwest. A tree will root in the top of the old growth stump, and they're called nursling trees. And this tree started sending roots down between the wood and the bark layer, and then the fire stripped that all away and revealed this amazing abstraction of new growth on the old growth. And another dug fir stump. I made this picture, and Fred walked over and I said, "What am I looking at?" And he said, "It's a living stump." So we know from some of the research of Suzanne Simard and others that there's a whole network underground sharing nutrients and information through fungal networks and root networks. And that's what's happening here. These small trees were either cut by logging in a thin, or they broke off. In either case, they healed over that wound completely, and then a nearby mother tree has been sending it nutrients so it survives, even though it has no needles or leaves to photosynthesize and create its own sugars and live on its own. I'm calling this next typology Stump Ghosts. I'm sure there's a term already out there for them. These are big cavities where these old growth stumps had been, and they completely burned in the fire. This cavity is about 12 feet across in its two widest points, and the dark spaces are where roots went down and they actually burned. In this particular cavity, the deepest tunnel I could measure went back 3.5 feet that actually burned and hollowed out. That was a stump ghost down by the river. And this is up on the hillside. You can see the very different soil type here. And the soil type up here is more a clay. And the saturated color is partly the clay and a result of the intense heat as that stump burned for weeks. And it's not that dissimilar from a clay pot and a firing and the intense colors that you can get as a result of the firing. I have a fantasy vision of a helicopter bringing a bucket on a winch line filled with molten bronze and pouring it into one of these cavities and creating an amazing sculpture. But I think that will probably live mostly in my mind. So the next approach we're taking is a technical approach, which uses 41 different photo points that Fred has very specifically picked out based on his knowledge of disturbance and forest and his curiosity about how they're going to regenerate. So he would pick the spot and direct me in where I would place the camera. And we kept all this specific camera technical data as well as the GPS location, and we drove a PVC stake in the ground so that we could come back every month for the next 2 years and have two images that we can compare. So you can see 41 sites over 24 visits will yield a lot of data and information for which Fred will be able to learn from and share. And so I'm going to turn it over to Fred now. Just click right there.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you, ecoartspace. I'm going to provide a little bit of context and introduce my part of this collaboration. This is an image looking up the McKenzie River. There on the right at the Three Sisters volcanoes at the crest of the High Cascades in the distance in snow. And we're looking up towards the source of the 173,000 acre holiday farm fire that began in early September. And you can see the forest was burned in various severities, and also 450 homes were destroyed. And we see the little town of Blue River at the bottom of the photo, and it was leveled by the fire. So we have quite an emotional tension here between the human tragedy that occurred in this fire, but also there's a stark beauty created by the fire. Our reference point for thinking about the effects of the fire come from our work in the H.J. Andrews experimental forest. At the edge of the fire, about 400 acres of the Andrews burned. And this is a place where both David and I have been conducting inquiry into the nature of old growth forest. Here's a view that's part of David's collection called Old Growth Dialogue. You can find it on his webpage and also in an article with an essay in terrain.org a couple years ago. So we have a long-term ecological research program at the Andrews Forest. And since 2002, we've had a long-term ecological reflections program, which brings artists and writers to the forest. We've had more than 100 folks in residence. And we do this in a collaboration between the Andrews Forest Science Program and the Spring Creek Project for Ideas, Nature, and the Written Word in Oregon State University. They are the arts and humanities partners. And the mission statement for Spring Creek is really our mission overall, which is to understand and reimagine our relation to the natural world. And in this image, we're seeing a piece of old growth forest with these 500-year-old Douglas fir trees, one on the right and one on the left. And this incredible profusion of life with hundreds of species of lichens and mosses and thousands of species of invertebrates. And this is in a research plot. You see two tiny aluminum tags there on those big old trees. So register on this. The fire goes through, not this particular site, but when the fire goes through, it exposes the skeleton of the forest ecosystem. And so here's one of the places where David is doing his photographic work. So an artist and a scientist together go to the forest, and we have our different focal points. First, we see this incredible complexity, whether it's the green forest or the blackened forest, because the fire comes through and paints with a very limited palette. And David focuses on forms and on color. And a scientist, me, a natural history kind of guy, I'm curious about processes, both physical and biological, and then history and how the forest composition marches over time, constantly changing through growth and disturbance. So our practices are to both compose and decompose our interpretations. So here's some examples of how form and color, process and history are displayed out there in the forest. On the left is a study of form, and David will close out our time by an elaboration of this project on the left. Standing Still is the title. On the right, we see how color is coming back into the forest. In this case, where two big limbs busted out of the top of the cedar tree, exposing the brown and yellow colors. So physical processes are reintroducing color to the landscape. Here's a case where biological processes, sprouting of the trees and ferns and mosses and oxalis and Oregon grape is bringing greens and oranges back into the landscape. David introduced the form of the canopy, and we're interested in how, as the canopy breaks down, it is delivering organic matter, needles and fine twigs and whole limbs and then whole boles to the forest floor. So some of our photo points are vertical panoramas from crown to ground, so we can track how these changes are occurring. My own interests are in looking at the components of the forest. Some of them actually are David's typologies, to try to unravel the layers of history represented there. So one of the stumps is marked A. That's one piece of evidence of the 500-year-old forest that occupied the site before that forest was logged 70, 80, 90 years ago. The new forest came in. These are some of the trees marked with Bs. Big maple cluster right in the middle, some hardwoods and conifers in the back. So those were the trees that burned, and then C marks patches of evidence within the stand that tell us about the nature of the fire as it moved through, such as the scorch ice on the trees. The Ds mark some of the biological responses to the fire, with sprouting at the base of those maples, for example. And the D at the very bottom is the litter layer on the ground, which itself is changing as material is delivered by falling from above and then decomposing. And one of the fun things for me has just been to watch David practice his craft. He's incredibly attentive and even risk-taking, but he's not afraid to get down and dirty and to dig into the stories here amidst the moss, which is really coming back in full force within the last month. And we expect to invite poets and other writers and other artists to come and join us in these places to enrich the storytelling that we expect will unfold over the coming months and years. And we're into it for the long haul. For example, at the Andrews Forest, we have a 200-year log decomposition experiment, now in year 36. So we want to take the long view. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Fred. So the next images I'm going to show you and end with here represent that personal expression, fine art look at the charred, burnt forest. My connection to these trees began before I ever saw them. It began as they were burning. I lived 90 miles downwind, and the ashes for days were settling all around me, and the smoke from their burning limbs and torsos filled my lungs. For more than 200 years, nature has beaten and battered these western red cedars with floods, erosion in the stream banks, fire, and wind. When I stood before them, I could feel this immense presence, this powerful presence, and I decided my approach, I wanted to make portraits. I wanted to honor their dignity as survivors, survivors who are standing still. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Patricia and Sant, and I'm sorry for the technical difficulties there.
No worries. Thank you so much, David and Fred. That was so informative. I so appreciate that you shared your collaboration and your collaboration process, because I think it gives all of us artists who are interested or who work with scientists more of an idea of what their relationship is and how that can really support each other's work. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the long-term results of this project working together. Also, if you two could put into the chat information on how people could find out more about the Long-Term Ecological Reflection Program at the Andrews Experimental Forest, because you mentioned, Fred, that there's been lots of artists who've come and worked with you, and I'm sure people would like to know more about that. So if you can put that in the chat, that would be fantastic. And of course, David, put your website up so people can look at more of your work. Okay, thank you so much. That was terrific.